Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m., Wednesday, the 11th of December, and you are watching episode 155 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap providing an insight on issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, paper as well as stones make a foundation, is my guest Sheriden Morris, two-time chair of the Cooperative Research Centre for Developing Northern Australia, which has been vested with the responsibility for the expenditure of $75 million of Commonwealth funding to support science-based research and development in the North, investing in the development of new technologies, products, services, which address industry's issues unique to Northern Australia. Sheriden is also currently the Managing Director and Company Secretary of Cairns non-profit-based Reef and Rainforest Research Centre and the Deputy Chair of Citizens for the Great Barrier Reef. Sheriden has extensive experience in environmental research and monitoring, management, agriculture development, agricultural science and agronomy in the sugar cane and banana industries of far North Queensland, and has served as Director of Wetlands Care Australia and has previously worked with CSIRO and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. As an extensive contributor to land and sea management policies, Sheriden has also spearheaded the development and implementation of innovative aid and development programs on Australia's North borderlands with Papua New Guinea. Welcome, Sheriden.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. We've come to this discussion thanks to a call I made to John Wharton, who is also on with your group, as a result of a newspaper article about a week and a half ago, where there was a bit of complaints about development in northern Queensland and some businesses sort of having issues with getting employees and a bit of dissipating population. And I think John went off on his normal sort of tangent in regards to land basing the southeast Queensland a little bit in regards to they're a little bit too focused on their own issues down there rather than looking north. But I can see that we have a lot of institutions up here that receive funding to look at issues in our area and things that are unique to us. And that's exactly what the cooperative is about, isn't it? So can you give us a bit of history before we get into that too much, just give us a bit of history about yourself, because you're down in Babinda. Is that a home for you as in from childhood, or where did you get your upbringing and that?
Well, I'm a completely Northern Australian girl. I grew up in the Northern Territory in Bachelor, Jungle, for those who know the Territory well, and attended a sort of half mission school there. Went across to Western Australia and Karratha and Dampier there when my father moved into the mining industry, and then eventually came across here to Cairns, where I was fortunate enough then to go to America running 400 metres on a scholarship, and I came back and did university at Queensland Uni Gatton and did agriculture, and found myself back up in North Queensland in Cairns, and have been pretty fortunate to work in some very interesting areas. And I've ended up being the Managing Director of the Reef and Rainforest Research Centre, which hosts the National Environmental Science Facility or program for Northern Australia, which is and has done for the last nearly 20 years, and also chairing the CRC for Developing Northern Australia. My focus is completely on Northern Australia, and I am as parochial as you get in that regard.
Well, it's quite interesting because next year will be the 10th anniversary of the release of Tony Abbott's white paper on the development of Northern Australia. And I think if next year we could have a bit of a rundown of all the things that have been achieved for Northern Australia since the release of that paper, I'd say it can't come to about naught, other than the Northern Australia infrastructure facility funding,
Mhm.
which it beggars belief. It was a $5 billion loan facility at a time when interest rates were at a historic low. So if you didn't have a good project, or if you had a good project, it shouldn't have been any problem getting a reasonable sort of loan in the commercial field. But I think the other funny thing about it was the bureaucracy for it was basically, set up in Canberra, and they had to be dragged by kicking and screaming to actually set up in Cairns. So yes, we have a lot of interest in Northern Australia, but it seems to be not really delivering. So, how does your $75 million funding, how does the oversight of that work, and how do you and of course there's a fairly large group on the board and that
Mhm.
so how is it all broken up and structured to a pick the projects to be considered, and then also the administration and things like KPIs.
So, um, we came out of the white paper as a CRC for developing Northern Australia as part of the white paper. So we developed at the same time as what the NAIF did. Yes, it's true the NAIF had some teething problems on the way through. They're a lot better now and a lot more focused in what they're doing. And you're quite correct in saying the structures that are developed in Southern Australia often aren't fit for purpose for Northern Australia, and the early days of the NAIF showed that out. Fortunately, they were able to adapt, so things have improved. For us, we have a reasonably large board, all situated in Northern Australia, all quite prominent people in Northern Australia, across Western Australia, Northern Territory, and Queensland, all who have good networks and particular expertise. It is an expertise-based board, and we do rely on those networks to bring information into the board. So, how it works is we cast out for applications, and this is how it has worked because we're fully expended now. But we cast out for applications and we have many applications for funds come in. What we do is apply a set of criteria, and it has to be bring benefit to Northern Australia. It has to be transferable. It has to involve technology or jumps forward that actually benefit Northern Australia. And what we tend to do is then go and broker. So just because someone put in an application doesn't mean we just instantly hand out the money. In brokering science, what you're doing is actually bringing often quite a number of groups together to get the best possible outcome you can for the investment. So we've been pretty fortunate. We've got just over 100 projects operate that are going through the process. We've generated the 75 million's generated and turned about 155 million, and about 657 jobs, and at the same time has it looks like delivering about 580 million all up from those investments into the northern economy. So our charter is to grow the northern economy, but at the same time look at how we build the fabric of Northern Australia. And we do that by looking specifically at ag, aquaculture, water, health service delivery, because they were initially wanted us to do health, but that was a bit pointless. It's health service delivery, which is hugely lacking in Northern Australia, and and First Nations led business. Because as you know, about 70+% of Northern Australia is owned by First Nations people. We have, 6,500 native food types that we could be exploiting. There's all sorts of advantages that we can be looking at. But the big difference between that and, say, what happens at a university is that we look not only to do the research, we look to drag the science and technology down into industry and to apply it. And we looked really heavily at things like supply chain, provenance advantage, and we did the assessment on what was missing in Northern Australia to make it work. And at the end of the day, we said our biggest thing, and you alluded to this earlier, was we needed to de-risk investment. So we have NAIF wanting to invest, we have international players wanting to invest, but investing in Northern Australia has inherent risks. One, the climate, the lack of communication, the poor infrastructure, all those things bring risks. But at the end of the day, de-risking, looking for how we can improve the approvals processes, looking how we can look for building the workforce, the capability within the workforce, those sorts of matters are the things that will dictate whether Northern Australia can develop to more than just a fly-in, fly-out colony to Southern Australia.
I think one of the things that sort of also people sort of look at is tangibles. Um, and tangibles means roads, dams, actually building concrete, things like that. We see things in regards to there's been good developments over the last 10, 15 years. I suppose a lot of it comes from the Ord River. I mean, they were out there in the early 70s trying to do agriculture on the Ord River, running into heaps of problems. But we certainly learned a lot from what went on the Ord River in regards to pests and all those, also plant diseases and things like that. And of course, we also learned how difficult it is to work up here. And and I'm not a fan of Kununurra. I think Kununurra is even a lot worse than Cairns. I mean, there is times when you just don't want to go there.
That's true.
It's pretty harsh. But we have learned a lot, and we've also developed things as well. We've got cotton now that works well up in the north. It needs less water, but we still have the same problem. People want to get a cotton gin built. There seems to be all sorts of roadblocks in that. People want to get a bit of irrigation in the system. I mean, we look at lakelands. I mean, it's got heaps and heaps of potential. How do we go from having potential to having delivery?
And that's one of our trickiest problems. So that's why we're focused on ag and water. One of our big programs up in northwestern Australia is cotton, corn, and cattle, and looking at how you integrate those to overcome some of those problems. See, we want to see development. And First Nations people want to see development too, by the way, but we want to see it in a sustainable way. We don't want to make the errors that they made down south, and we want to use technology to jump over a whole lot of those problems. We do have a few prejudices, and I'll be really plain about those on the table. Southern Australia often sees Northern Australia as their way of meeting their environmental concerns and needs. And but we think with some good technology, we can have some sustainable development. But we need to be in front of the game. We need to do the planning that allows that. It doesn't. This concept of lock it up and throw away the key is silly. And it's not what we need in Northern Australia for a whole series of reasons, and defence and our geopolitical position being even just one of them. So we need to actually start looking at how we can be, and the term at the moment is nature positive, and still do the developments that we need. Because we have massive nature-based tourism across Northern Australia. So we don't want to damage that. But at the same time, we do want to see ag and irrigated ag improve and increase, and we can do that. So that's why we have a big program around water and making water work much more effectively. And there's technologies we can introduce now. We have seen some infrastructure advantages. We've had the beef roads come in. We've seen improved connectivity. Those communications improvements are going to be a really big thing for supply chain and some of the things that have historically held us back. But I will say we need more investment. We're critically short of some of that infrastructure, and that goes around all the things that lead to livability as well. It's hard to live in Northern Australia, and you know that, I know that because we live up here. It's hard, when you hear somebody say, oh, COVID is over, we'll stop, telehealth. Start going to your GP again. We just laugh up here. What GP? How do you get to another GP? How do we bring first world health services into remote and regional Australia? How do we overcome those? How do we bring education services in at the next level? And can I tell you, the people who are working in these areas now are doing a fantastic job for the resources they have. Those resources need to pick up fully if we are going to have communities across Northern Australia that fill a basic fabric of community.
I think in regards to risk and sort of reducing the risk for investors, that applies a fair bit into private investment. You're not going to get private investment if people perceive a risk. However, that doesn't excuse the federal and state governments from delivering the infrastructure that lays the groundwork to negate some of that risk. That means roads, bridges, dams, all those sorts of things. There's no excuse for the government in regards to bringing up this risk thing.
It also means proper planning. So it's no good if we lay out the welcome mat and say, come in and invest. And then they come in, they do all their initial reviews, they do all their population dynamic studies, they spend $20 million. And then they're three-quarters of the way through the system. And then we say, nah, we don't want it here. That's a sovereign risk to the future of Australia. We can't be doing that. It's not only the hard infrastructure, it's also the soft infrastructure. That's improved planning. That's more support for private investment coming in. That's what that means. Sorry to cut you
No,
off.
no. But also, to me, you just touched on things like nature positive. I just see that everything in regards to getting anything through in the north in particular, and just about anywhere in the region, has a clear set of roadblocks that has to, and hurdles that has to jump over, and these hurdles have been put in place over time, and they seem to be adding more and more. This focus, I understand, right? We can't go around decimating nature and things like that, but we can't be anti-human either. I mean, if you want the North to develop, you actually have to work within the boundaries you got, but not create complete barriers that you can't do anything. Like, Northern Australia has got heaps of space. It's got 80% of mainland Australia's rainfall, and it beggars belief that we can't sort of do more irrigation and more dams and more water storage and distribution. Because if you look at the Murray-Darling Basin, that only has 6% of mainland Australia's rainfall. Now, you can't turn around and tell me we haven't got sufficient water in our northern river systems to do these projects. But every time you seem to sort of talk about Lakelands, the Hewitt irrigation project, you come up with one fight after another from, I'll put it out there, academics really who work on these theories in regards to we've got to have somewhere between 93 and 97% of the river flow flowing out to sea. No, we can't develop if you've got a regime or a criteria that says you've got to let 93 to 97% of all water going for a river flow out to sea. We've got to get rid of some of that sort of stuff.
And a big part of the problem is that, and I'll say it again, we haven't done the appropriate planning. And, I know that sounds really boring, but the reality is we need to say, yes, we want to do a development. What do we need to do to make it a sustainable, sensible development in that area? At the moment, it's piecemeal. And because we haven't done that, we've abrogated all the decision making, or a vast quantity of decision making in Northern Australia to mid-career bureaucrats in Canberra in the assessment branch, down in EPBC assessment branch. And so you have people who have never been in Northern Australia, never participated or understand the process, suddenly having to make decisions under a very constrained framework that stops us from actually having development. If we had designate areas where you can have development of a particular type in a designated area, if you undertake these factors, that would de-risk that development fully. And we push very hard for this to happen. So around Lakeland, etc., you would designate the area, and that would soil type and soil viability would also help designate that area. Identify how much water is available, and then say you don't have to go through separate EPBC approvals for every single one of that. This entire area can be developed against these principles. And that means anyone coming into that area knows where the guardrails are, know where the goalposts are, and can go ahead and do it. If we don't do that in Northern Australia, with this piecemeal approach of one here, one there, one everything else, is just going to keep messing up. And you'll find bits getting knocked back, and we will lose the opportunity and advantage that Northern Australia currently has. Well, we are losing it. Let's be honest about that.
But it's not only that, we also have situations where they move the goalpost too. So, and you're just referring to, we have these bureaucrats that are sort of, got the overlying responsibility. But it doesn't help when that bureaucracy is full of activists. You can't tell me that these bureaucrats that are in Brisbane and also in Canberra don't have an element within them that are activists in regards to environment and that. I mean, you can't have a state government that has a chief of staff who actually came from the conservation movement, and he's the chief of staff of the environment minister first, and then goes on to be the chief of staff of the premier. So it's a little bit difficult for us.
Look, rather than play the personal game, I actually think, how do you overcome that system? And it comes down to our governance frameworks that we have in Northern Australia. And, that the thing I'm talking about, that style of planning goes on in Southern Australia all the time. It's no one ever finds the finances or dollars or commitment to do it in Northern Australia. It comes down to our overarching government. It comes down to our representation. As we spoke earlier, we've only got 12 representatives across in the House of Reps across the whole of Northern Australia. We only have a handful of senators. Yet I'm sounding like I'm whinging now, and I'm sounding like I'm whinging, but I don't mean to. But then when you look, if you just look at Townsville, Cairns and Mackay, it has a greater population than Tasmania, and they have 12 senators and a whole handful of representatives and have a much bigger say in the, governance discourse than what we have across Northern Australia. Granted, and when you look at where we sit, whilst we only have, 5.3% of the population and, 13% of the GDP, but if you look at the export dollars, we generate over nearly 70% of Australia's export dollars come out of Northern Australia. So we need a greater say in how to make this stuff work. So rather than, I don't go after I actually feel sorry for the poor bugger down in Canberra having to make a decision because, they're not in a position to be doing that. And yet they're forced into that scenario. We're much better to have vested more competently in the direction we need to go. And that takes leadership in government. It takes investment into those regimes that we need, and it takes a commitment that we are going to build those communities up. Now, some of that commitment is coming via defence right now, so we are going to see infrastructure come into play via defence. What we need to be doing is making sure defence and the local communities are discussing and becoming part of it. We're now going to see rare minerals and mining take off for another bout now in Northern Australia. So it makes us a very important asset to Australia. How we invest in that asset is the discussion we really need to be having.
Well, that's sort of in regards to the people who run the country and run the state. They seem to have lost the plot about growing the pie. If you go to election cycles and things like that, it's all about getting votes, buying votes, spending
Mm.
money on people. There doesn't seem to be such a big investment in the country and wealth creation. There's very few wealth creating projects anymore. I mean, we've got some of the biggest spends going on now in renewable energy, but none of those projects actually grow the economy. If anything, they suck money out of the economy because it's created an overseas supply chain and dependence. It also doesn't deliver cheap power, or doesn't seem to be delivering cheap power, so we lose our advantage of cheap energy. Um, do you see any light at the tunnel in regards to what sort of framework could be put around so that we have a strategic look at Australia in regards to growing the pie and critical major projects that create wealth, national wealth?
I think as we see the changing geopolitical environment, Australia, north of us, has 400 million people facing north from Northern Australia and has about, 25, 26 million people facing south. As as the world goes through further and further tensions around the geopolitical arrangements, particularly in the Pacific and then across to the Indian Ocean, we will see the importance of Northern Australia come to the fore again, as it did previously when tensions arose around the world. With that, we will see the need for our transition zones, and gas is going to become a really important component in that transition framework. And how we manage gas, how we manage that development for Australia's benefit. Often what we see in Northern Australia is we can actually generate export income that actually brings benefit to Australia, but doesn't bring that much benefit to Northern Australia. So our focus is how do we build up that framework much more strongly so that we don't see, Northern Australia is rude with opportunity for both renewables, but also with pre-existing energy sources. So our energy independence is going to come in Australia, is going to come from Northern Australia. Much of our food security in the future will come from Northern Australia. Our water security will come from Northern Australia. 60% of the water happens in Northern Australia and runoff, and we send a lot of it down south through the Murray-Darling and other places. But, much of that will come from Northern Australia. So Australia going into the future, how it focuses on developing Northern Australia is going to dictate a lot of its productivity and its wealth into the future. That's it in a
Well, I,
nutshell.
I would have thought that was the purpose of the white paper in the first place, and it should have been built on. But it never has. I mean, if you look at, I think every year the Minister for Northern Australia gets up and does a speech on the progress and that. I think Madeleine de King is or Northern Australian. I don't think she even delivered the speech last year. It was handed down to someone else because she was away. But really, there's no real substance in it. There's no talk of major projects or major spending in Northern Australia by the government, and we see that within our infrastructure.
Well, the investment into the NAIF was an important investment, and that came from the white paper, and that is starting to deliver down the line, and we'll see that start to come to fruition. The investments into aquaculture that we see running forward, and I predict that aquaculture is going to be a huge industry in Northern Australia. We have 10,000 kilometres of coastal area in Northern Australia, much of which is not polluted, much is in very good condition, and it's open potentially for some really advances in sustainable aquaculture. I can see a future for Northern Australia if we actually decide, if we have the leadership to do it. I know people are committed now, and those who are working in the fields are doing what they can with the resources. So I'm from Northern Australia, so I'm always going to ask for more resources. And as the CRCNA starts to wind down, because our period of time is coming to an end, it will be completely finished at the end of 2026. Rolling into 27, we're looking for mechanisms of how we can actually get a organisation up or an institute up that will focus specifically on Northern Australian issues. So we have institutes that look at extreme events and bushfires and all that, but very few understand the challenges of Northern Australia and actually how to bring technology into these areas so we can actually move forward. We look to see how we can work much more closely with defence. So we can actually look at cooperative arrangements more with defence. So not only does defence meet its objectives, but we also can get community benefit out of that. We look at how we can build on First Nations needs. There's a significant investment into First Nations, but people seem to think that they want to keep it all as lock it up and throw away the key. Most First Nations communities want to do development. They want to move forward and they want to move forward in a sustainable way. They've often been used as a weapon inappropriately, I would argue, but there's many who want to move forward in that regard. So we'll be looking at how to do sustainable development and hopefully can push some of our agendas forward. We've had some real successes around health and health service delivery, real ability to bring better quality services out into remote Australia. We need to be able to do that cheaply so we can get first world outcomes straight away. Because to be perfectly honest, it doesn't matter what community you're from, all our vitals around health are substandard compared to what you see in southern Australia. So we need to actually start moving that needle better so people want to come and live in Northern Australia. And we may have to look at how you actually exist and work in very harsh tropical environments. And that means different clothing, that means maybe air-conditioned suits, that means all sorts of things. So we've got to be moving. And if we tend not to, and if we abandon Northern Australia and keep leaking the capacity out of Northern Australia, we leave it vulnerable and we leave it to having to go to defence all the time.
But there's, if you look at the things that have been going on over the last few years. I mean, I've only been up here for 12 years, and I haven't seen any progress whatsoever in sort of major projects. I mean, all I've heard about is the difficulties in getting something off the ground, like the Hewden irrigation project, dam up at Lakelands. We've got active programs where people are going, and the government is putting more areas under the protective areas thing, uh, buying up cattle stations, things like that, then turn them into protected areas, basically knocking all the infrastructure down that was built up over hundreds of years. And they're getting good at that because what's happened, they've brought in legislation that makes it difficult for farmers and graziers to make a profit anymore or have a good life. And so what's happened, there's a lot of properties that have been in people's hands for generations, but the next generation doesn't really want to take it over because all it sees is more and more restrictions and burdens in regards to operating in that. So is there also a legislative framework we need to look at and sort of start looking at things that make life difficult to actually do business in North Queensland?
And that's a de-risking. That's looking at how can we actually do business and community much better in Northern Australia. And you're right, the old joke is, it's child abuse handing your farm, across to your children. Or how do you make a fortune in Northern Australia farming? Start off with a beggar fortune and then see it dwindle down. So, yeah, there are all the challenges. There are other industries coming into the play, and there may be some changes, and there will be some changes. Like it all or not, we're going to have a carbon industry, and Northern Australia can position itself into a carbon industry, and that's going to bring benefit. One thing that we do have that we can do, particularly in the really tropical areas, is we grow trees very fast. So, and that gives us a very good carbon return. So,
but that's a non-tan. That's still basically locking up land and not doing anything with it. It's not even harvesting the trees to make use timber products. It's just basically locking up land. It makes trading pieces of paper great, but it doesn't build anything. It creates few jobs, and as far as I see it, it's a real frustration for a lot of people. And the incentive, making an incentive for people to lock up land and say, well, I'm just going to turn this into a carbon sink. I'm not actually going to generate any real wealth out of it other than trading a piece of paper.
and that's one of the real trade-offs in this process that we have to look at. We have to look at how to get the most out of that land and looking at appropriate soil types and the like for development, because we still have considerable amount of country that can be developed appropriately across Northern Australia. And I think some of the slow take-up of that is problematic. The other big area of development is agriculture. And truly, that has a huge amount of potential across Northern Australia. And as we see some major companies, international companies, as well as Australian-based companies buying into the agriculture industry up and down the north. And currently, we only produce about 20% of agriculture product, but I predict that's going to go up significantly. We're doing that currently out of Nullumboy with Ndili Aqua Indigenous group there. They're now growing 700,000 tropical blacklip oysters. And those oysters have, are being harvested for sale in southern Australia. But we have, what do you call them? Ornata out of Townsville growing the painted cray up and aquaculturing painted cray. We have Tazal and many others doing prawns up and down the coast. We have barramundi that's taken off well and truly. So we have industries that are developing and getting better and better in the region. We need better supply chain, we need better services, we need better communications, and we need better disaster risk reduction to manage those things.
But at the same time, we kill off our wild fishing industry. It's sort of a bit counterproductive there that you basically almost completely decimated the commercial fishing industry and the aquaculture industry. I think it's getting a couple of free passes at the moment because that does generate a lot of uh, chemicals and fertilizers and protein stuff in its water, and it does have a little bit of an advantage in regards to what it can leach out of their farms compared to what a banana farmer grows. But I think as time goes by, there might be some checks and balances on that. So I
I
think
don't know if
that's
the aquaculture industry would agree with you. They would say that they're heavily,
well, yeah.
heavily
Well,
done.
we'll see.
Yeah,
But
but But I will say, again, technologies can win the day there. They don't have to be pollutant. There's a lot of things aquaculture can do to actually reduce its pollutant load. There's a lot of things that I'm a banana farmer. There's a lot of things banana farmers can do to reduce their pollution load. And we don't want to decimate the wild uh, fish industry, but at the same time, it's struggling a bit. We're down, look at mackerel, Spanish mackerel, we're down to 17% of the population now from where it was. So,
well, that's argued in regards to where they started to get those figures from, because there's
1980s.
the fishermen are not going to agree with that. But
Mm.
I mean that's another conversation. But we do seem to have a bit of loaded science against development, farming development and that. Also it seems like the Great Barrier Reef seems to be disadvantaged for us in a lot of cases because it's always thrown up in regards to we've
Oh,
got to protect the reef um,
I
and all the
agree.
employment.
Yeah,
So it may, I think there's a bit of overloading with some of it, but I still would like to see some tangible. I'd like to see the cotton industry, start going ahead. People getting permits to build cotton gins without have to jump around, 10,000 hoops, and then say, "Oh, too bad. I'm not going to go through this because it's costing us too much money just to get it off the ground." So, like you say, we've got to de-risk this. But
Absolutely.
do we need a body and that has some gravitas and a single body? Because we seem to have a lot of organisations, but do we need to amalgamate, strengthen one big power block so it does carry a big stick when it goes down to Canberra, or Canberra is part of that stick to get things going?
I can tell you it is incredibly difficult to get money above the Brisbane line. And it takes every bit of skill for any organisation to acquire investments up in the north. And and for the time I have been doing it now for over 20 years, I can tell you it takes every bit of influence that we can possibly get. We're hoping to actually put together an influential institute that can help form policy and help Southern Australia actually invest adequately and appropriately in Northern Australia. With a passion. We can't just go and bang the desk and say, you've got to give us, because they just won't. What you've got to do is build the investment framework for the South to start reinvesting back up in the North. Because the reality is, we generate a whole lot of the export dollars. We don't see it come back at the level that we need to see it come back to actually bring the North forward. There, the other thing is the skepticism for development in Northern Australia. There's been a lot of dreams or a lot of concepts have withered on the vine up in the north, whether it be the Ord when it first happened, and the Ord is starting to move forward now, contrary to a lot of people point to the Ord and say it was a disaster. It's no longer a disaster, and it is starting to generate. They point to the Pilbara. The Pilbara is a massive generator of funds for Australia in general. When you come across to Northern Territory, is just starting to find its feet in those regards. And then you come across to North Queensland, which is the biggest agricultural producer by a long shot across Northern Australia. Actually, if you look at it, Northern Queensland probably has the best infrastructure arrangements and things across there. So
Well, it's the most settled part of the north. I mean,
it certainly is.
it's got quite a network of towns. The only unfortunate thing is a lot of those things are withering because of the lack of investment over time with infrastructure that
And capability, and capability.
needs to be addressed.
We have three universities in Northern Australia, Queensland Central University, James Cook University, and Charles Darwin University. And they've been hit pretty hard lately. As regional universities, they do struggle. And what we do see is capability diminish. And what happens then is we have to fly in skill sets. And when you fly in people, we call without who don't know the culture and the frameworks of Northern Australia, the results they come up with and the advice that they end up giving often isn't as fit for purpose as what it needs to be. So we need to hold capability in Northern Australia. We need skill sets. You know, we don't have enough fitter and turners, plumbers, you know, guys on the tools. We don't have enough engineers and at working in Northern Australia. So how do we get those people up to Northern Australia and have them stay sufficiently long to impact and help build the capacity? Because it won't build out of nothing. You've got to have skills and ability to do that.
We always had skills and ability. It's just that people thought there's better opportunities for the kids down in Brisbane and that. So if you go down to Brisbane and talk to a lot of people, you'll find heaps that actually originated out of North Queensland and have gone there, you know, as high school or university and people and never came back. So it's what's lacking, to my way of thinking, is what people's perceived amenity is.
Livability.
If you look at, there's more miners in the Queensland mining industry in the suburbs of southeast Queensland and in Brisbane than there are miners in central and north Queensland. That's a ridiculous situation. The reason that's happening is because they allowed the fly in, fly out, but they also gave up on getting the mining companies to be part of the communities up here and building around that where they used to be before. So
So it comes
people,
down to health service delivery, education
amenities.
delivery, and amenities and livability. And so that's where a big focus is how you can cost effectively bring those services in. The mining companies did back away because it says it costs too much and it's too difficult to have these communities up in the middle of nowhere. But the reality is we need those networks of communities if we are going to build a cohesive fabric across Northern Australia. That's it in a
But,
nut.
but a lot of these places aren't in the middle of nowhere. If you look at the coal seams, you're talking about places like Claremont and those. There's a whole lot of small towns there that can be built up if the will was there for these mining companies. And we just don't need people to come and exploit. There has to be some sort of mechanism to, if you go to come and take something out, you put something in. And that's
I
how it
agree.
used to be. That's how it used to be before, because before the days of aeroplanes and things like that, and get in and out in communications, they had to actually stay and work here, and we derived the benefit. I think
Agreed.
we still need to look at that and look at the legislation. But the other thing is we need, like you say, the de-risking, and there must be a lot of legislation that you must look at and see and go, gee, that's holding us back, or um,
Or we look at it and say, we have the technology to overcome this. Why won't you let us use that technology and address? I said, you don't want this development because you can see this problem. Let us use technology to take that problem away. And we've got some pretty clever players around who can actually do a lot of this stuff in a sensible way. And our biggest efforts now is how we de-risk it and how we convince southern states of what we're doing. We're not going to have the same linear development that they had. We're going to use technology to jump over a whole lot of things. We're using drones. We don't need as many tractors. We're using all sorts of things in very different ways. We'll use communication. We'll use supply chain. We'll use provenance, blockchain, all quite differently to how they've done it historically in the southern states. And we can do that moving forward. So the way to actually de-risk is to use the advances and technologies that we have available to us. We don't have to go back to the 1950s. We actually have to jump forward and use things to make it more livable and more usable for Northern Australia. So it's
well,
future looking.
it also requires commitment by
It
governments and
does.
planners. And you can see like things with the last state government. It managed at a drop of a hat to find $12 billion for a pumped hydro system, right? And even set up a corporation. But they can't even see the viability of putting another 14 meters on the Burdekin Falls Dam. They can't see a viability of putting a project up at Lakelands down there, or something on the Mitchell. So it's also their focus that's not when you come to look at that. I mean, they'll drop that, and they are dropping billions of dollars on renewable projects throughout the place. But I don't see a water project going on. I don't see a major road connector going through up here. So
So
how
we
how
did.
do how do we get support from those governments to say, well, you're getting 80% of your wealth from Northern Australia. How about growing the wealth a bit more and growing it from within North Queensland? I mean, if it wasn't for iron ore and coal, Australian dollar would probably be about 30 cents US.
So it comes down to us making our arguments more cogent and more realistic. So, you do have to operate within the framework that the government of the day has. So you have to couch your arguments in within that framework. Northern Australia's got a lot of dreams going with it, and it's often dismissed. And the reality is, if you wanted to increase, say, GDP, and you had $5 billion, you probably wouldn't invest it directly into Northern Australia because of the risks. right? So it means we have to look at the steps we need to take to make those investment frameworks return funds, do the things that they need to do. And that means much better planning, much better understanding, and putting those arguments together much more clearly. Making water work, which is probably one of our really big themes, is seriously focused on doing that into the future. So we can make the arguments for water storage and off river water storage and others to actually, and how we use groundwater and how we use other things. So we can actually go forward and develop some of those industries. There is potential water there. There is some, it's not a huge breadbasket, but there are some good quality soils that we can do some agricultural development on. That's what we need to be looking at.
Well, there's a huge amount of fertile land if you just add water. I mean, the whole area around Georgetown and south there, that
Mm.
volcanic land, just add water and anything will grow. It's like
On
lakelands.
the
There's
Black Earth.
heaps more potential there uh, with water. But we can't go forward if the government's setting criteria like cost benefit analysis where it says if you want to build a dam, well you've got to get your capital back in 30 years. So this means if you've got a storage of so much, you have to sell it at this much to get uh, get that capital back. Some of these things, like on the Ningla Dam and things like that, they were calculating that the return of capital. They needed to sell water at $5,000 a megalitre. Like no farmer's going to go in that. They've got to get realistic with some of their criteria for cost benefit analysis.
And that goes back to Infrastructure Australia and the discussions we need to have on infrastructure and whether we want to invest into the future. Those terms aren't applied to defence, they're not applied to many of the other areas. It's interesting that they apply so specifically to water. We can't build unrealistic things at the same time. You know, we're never going to have a Bradfield scheme per se. But what we can do is there are plenty of options that are technically able to be developed. Now, they probably won't return, but I do think we need to start putting a social dividend and a development dividend onto that equation that you articulated. And so because Southern Australia was developed, if they said the Snowy River scheme was subject to the same criteria, it would never have been built. None of those things would have ever been built. So Southern Australia had the privilege of that investment. And so we need to be arguing that that needs to come to Northern Australia now.
But I thought it would also be the onus would also be on the government in regards to having a belief in nation building, and that we would be part of that conversation going forward. Projects in the north that actually are nation building, but we don't seem to be getting that dialogue from the powers that be.
And that cycles us right the way back to our earliest conversation, where we say our political representation and the amount of representation and discussion and part of the political discourse, we're hugely limited in Northern Australia. The representatives we do have from both sides of government try really hard, but the Northern Australian Standing Committee in Parliament was cut down to reduced down. We don't have the Prime Minister and the Chief Ministers across the three jurisdictions meeting anymore. It's been cast down to lower ministers within the organisation. We aren't seeing the actual commitment. And so we have to actually talk about, do we need better insights into the political discourse so we can start to get some of these things on the table? Because when the discussions are being had, there's just not enough of us to make an influence at this point in time.
Well, the sad part is it's only going to get worse. Our political representation is going to diminish as the population in the south grows in the southeast corner. We're going to go to the 28 election with a redistribution of the Queensland state electorates in about 2027. There's going to be nearly 550,000 people added to the roll since the last redistribution. And we're going to lose 2 seats in central and north Queensland to make up for the huge population growth in southeast Queensland. So that isn't good. And the redistributions that happen even in this federal sphere sees regional seats disappear. Admittedly, it's slowly, but it is diminishing. Uh, we've seen a number of, since about 86, I think we've seen 3 regional federal seats disappear out of the system. So it's never going to get better that way. We're never going to have improved clout. We just have to somehow become more important in the overall schemes of the conversation in regards to Australia's wealth.
And becoming more important. Like you've got to hand it to to the senators who represent Northern Australia and to our elected House of Reps representatives that go down there. They've got huge electorates, and they've got amazing cross section of population in different areas. You know, you've got. I live in Katter country, and we come from in the rainforest where we get, 6 meters of rain a year, all the way out to Mount Isa. And the challenges across that enormous area, and we've got one representative who's supposed to be able to deal with all those matters at once. It's just almost unrealistic. And so we're not looking for a major perversion of Australia's political system. We are looking at ways of putting more influence into the process. And you can do that by developing institutes and organisations that can actually inform the political conversation. You can do that by doing the studies and the structures that you need and the frameworks that you need to get the outcomes that we're all chasing. Sitting up here just whinging about it, and I can whinge like the best of them about what's not happening in Northern Australia. But I also know there are steps that we can take to improve things. I also know that to get money over the Brisbane line takes a huge amount of effort, and we need influence to enable that. So we just have to keep pushing.
Well, it's going to be a hard task, and I wish you all the best. But moving forward, John did indicate that your tenure for the cooperative is going to run out next year. But there's talk about a new organisation.
Well, that's what I was alluding to. We're seeing what organisations we can bring together, the universities, other entities that we can bring together, plus all the jurisdictions, Queensland, Northern Territory, and Northwestern Australia. What can we bring together to actually increase our voice, and how we structure that? And that things that would enable us to broker planning, to help de-risk investment into Northern Australia, to focus on much more cost-effective technologies for cost-effective service delivery, the things that we know are impeding the development in Northern Australia now. We've got 10 years worth of experience. I'm getting bombed by bugs here because I'm outside. Yeah, we're in Northern Australia. Of course, we're going to get bombed. I think we're going to get a storm, so the flying ants are gone crazy. So we've spent a decade really honing in on what the issues are, where we can actually make inroads, how to move forward, how to get changes on the ground. And now we don't want to lose that, and we want to take that to the next level. And we are looking to do that through the development of an institute for Northern Australia, the development of sustainable development of Northern Australia. So this meets the environmental needs, but it also meets all the needs we have to do to de-risk competent and critical investment into the assets of Northern Australia. which are many.
Well, I think you've got Gina Reinhardt basically on side in regards to, I think her organised HANDEV, I think it's Australians for Northern Australian Vision or something like that, development and vision. And I think it's Australians for Northern Development and Economic Vision or something like that, HANDEV. Um, they're quite focused on Northern Australia. It's a little bit focused on Western Australia a bit more than Queensland, but there are people around that probably get good support from. Uh, yeah, so and I mean, I don't. There's also organisations like Regional Institute of Australia and that out of Canberra, and this is what worries me about a lot of places. That they have headquarters in Canberra. I know they've got to be in contact with the government and bureaucrats to sort of get their message across, but sometimes they're just not visible here, and that's a bit of a problem.
And I also honestly believe you can't actually understand the culture of Northern Australia until you've lived in it, until you participate in it, till you've tried to do business in it, you know, till you run a property or tried to bought houses, tried to do business in Northern Australia. And it opens your eyes up to the challenges that really exist in the north. So it's not just the torrid climate, it's not just the wildness of the monsoons, the risks that come from extreme events. It's all the failed structural bureaucracy, lack of planning, and lack of process that's also inhibiting where we're going forward.
And legislation that makes life more difficult on purpose in regards to the environment. I
I'm not
think
sure it's on purpose. I think
I,
it's intended, but it's not
the
a whole lot of it's
unintended consequences, maybe.
consequences. Yeah, it's not fit for purpose for what we need up here.
Yeah.
And
Oh, well,
that's what we're trying to get over.
well, when would you sort of get an idea that the next organisation is going to get the tick in the box sort of thing?
We're hoping to hear it in the election platforms coming up with this election. So we're hoping we'll have our ear tuned to hear if, what each side of government is looking to bring to Northern Australia. And we're hoping to hear the keenness of investment into Northern Australia and how serious each side of government is about what goes on in Northern Australia. And so our ear will be to the ground on whether there is recognition of the need.
Well, I'm hoping that their focus is on development, not locking it up on more nature positive things and making life even more difficult. Because that's as a person who doesn't come, I come from West Australia. Historically, I don't have any vested interest in North Queensland, but I would really like to see it develop in regards to its full potential. But we seem to have so many roadblocks. And you'd be well aware, simple things in regards having an effective transport corridor between the Port of Cairns and the Tablelands.
Mm.
That's now almost non-existent. Yet you can see what's happened in Toowoomba, the connector down there. Not only have they got a great connector, they also they've got a good bypass system as well.
Mhm.
So that's opened up heaps and heaps of development for them and made life a lot easier for businesses. But we don't seem to have that interest here.
All I know is that we're very keen to see the comfortable coexistence between our amazing natural assets that we have, noting that we have 7 World Heritage Areas and we have huge international visitation, which brings in international dollars. So I actually strongly believe you can see a comfortable coexistence between being positive in the nature regime as well as having good quality development. And I
Especially
don't
when
see
you've
the
got
two,
so much space.
yeah, I don't see the two as being opposite sides or opposing sides. I see, even with the Great Barrier Reef there, I see farming can exist comfortably adjacent to the Great Barrier Reef. And And the steps that are being taken can actually enable that. I don't see it has to be such a adversaries coming into a warring agenda all the time. And many of the steps we take now allow us to do those things. So it comes down to being clever. And hey, Northerners have always figured out how to be resilient, how to solve problems, and how to be clever about it. And that's something I think we can bring to the table.
All we have to do is get clever enough to beat some of those people down the south and get them on side.
That's very true.
Okay,
Okay.
if you just want to just wrap it up now in regards to what you're looking forward as deliveries as the cooperative winds up, um, and um, and how many people you've got to thank for all their efforts, not individually, but just in general for their efforts and inputs and deliverables.
So we've had an amazing opportunity to take through the CRC for Developing Northern Australia, to take a very close look at where the opportunities are and where the impediments are for development in Northern Australia. We've also had opportunity to invest in industries and particularly into agriculture through the cattle, corn and cotton efforts up in Northern Australia in the Kimberley region. And we've seen big progress to that. And that's also come across into the Northern Territory, particularly with some of the cotton developments there. We've seen big developments in aquaculture and particularly First Nations aquaculture, but a whole range of others. And we know that has enormous potential into the future. We've also seen developments in forestry and particularly up in the north in Tiwi Islands, and that we've had big progress there. Our breakthroughs in health service delivery around glaucoma for eye treatment and using advances in telehealth to actually get really first world available medical assistance actually in remote Australia. And we're looking at how we can progress that even further. So we've also had progress around water. And water is a challenge, as anyone would know, and we're making some progress there. So we're pretty excited in the big steps that have gone forward. We have a lot of people to thank, and most of those people are the industries that we work with. Remember, we have over 270 industry partners that we've been working with to do that. And there's a big thank you to those. We have a very small staff who work really hard brokering projects and making them come together more effectively. And then we have an amazing board who have a network right across Northern Australia. So we're always testing and looking for how to go forward. You plugged into that network through John Wharton, but there are many players across. We've got Peter Long over in Western Australia, and we have Rebecca Moore-Bell in Northern Territory, plus others, as we move across the state, and we've got quite a few in Queensland. So we've been fortunate. We are able to actually put cogent and effective policy positions into the government system and policy development. But we need, now that we actually know many of those things, we need to build on them now and actually turn a lot of it into much stronger on-ground action and help develop the policies that will actually strengthen Northern Australia. So this isn't a wish list, oh, I'd like to see this and I'd like to see that. This is a very, very considered framework for what actually works and how to take those cohesive steps. It's not one big panacea or one silver bullet. There's a whole series of steps that are needed to build the fabrics of communities across Northern Australia and support the ones that are already there. And that will go from immigration, defence, energy sectors, mining sectors, tourism sectors, as well as ag, aquaculture, etc., and health and education. So it's a big, big framework. The CRCs generally only focus very much on a small component of an industry. We have to focus on the whole agenda at once. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to continue some of this work, and we're hopeful to make further impact and bigger impact as we go into the future. So thank you for the opportunity, Bill.
Thank you very much for your time tonight. I really appreciate it. If you just hold there, I'll introduce next week's show and have a quick chat with you offline. But thanks again, Sheridan. Really appreciate your time. And hopefully the bugs slow down a little bit.
Yeah, they're getting pretty wild now.
If you enjoyed tonight's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, I'll be talking to David Archibald, and we'll be discussing the nuclear energy as we roll forward to the coalition announcing its costing and that for its nuclear power plant systems. So please join us again next week. Thank you.